So the workflow here is to copy the layer, choose the tool, select a brush, often a brush without any hardness, and a nice small brush, so you can work on an area of the image. For the exposure, like we've seen with some of our other tools, we'll want to bring this down. You want to try probably somewhere around 10 or 15% to start with. Next, zoom in on the area of the image you want to work on, and then just start to paint over that. And what we can do with this is we can start to bring out these shadows. Now, the first step of this process will be to paint over the shadows, and then the second step will actually be to work on the color that we have there. So if you notice a slight color shift, or if it's looking like it's turning a little bit gray, don't worry about that too much just yet. We'll look at how we can fix that next. And so here, going over this area, painting away all of these different little shadows that I'm noticing, just a little bit at a time. Tap the left bracket key to make my brush smaller if I want to work on a really focused little wrinkle. And I should also point out that this tool didn't work as well in previous versions of Photoshop, but in the latest versions, in the last few at least, it's just working a lot better. So it's a much more valid and great tool to use. You can use this to really work on shadows and details in the image in a nice way. It's also nice when you need to maintain a certain level of sharpness in the image, because here what you can see, we're not really covering this up with anything. We're really just minimizing those shadows. We can work on shadows in other areas. I'll work on this little shadow around the corner of the mouth here. If you want to work at more intensity, just increase your setting there, your exposure value. And then with that, you need to make the brush a little bit smaller. You just want to be careful that you aren't brightening up anything unnecessarily, because as we saw, while it does target those darker tones, it will reach into some other areas. So it isn't perfect. It's not going to only affect the shadows, because the shadows here, they're not super dark. They're made up of other tones. All right, well, here we have the adjustments on this new layer. Let's take a look at how it appears. Here's the before and after. Let me zoom out so you can see that from a pulled back perspective. And what we can see here is we have a nice work done on a lot of these little shadows here. The only downside with this technique is that the area that you work on tends to lose some color. So it looks a little gray, which isn't very good. And so these next two steps are the steps that most people neglect to take. And it's kind of a bummer, because the next two steps really help finish this off. And here they are. What you want to do is, after you've applied this effect or used this tool, you need to change the layer blending mode to one which is called luminosity. The luminosity blending mode says, hey, primarily just use what's on this layer, but use the brightness values and kind of ignore the color. So when we select that, what we'll see, let me zoom in so you can see that a little bit better, is that all of a sudden we have a little bit more color in those areas. Can you see that in this area and over here? Take a look at those, and that luminosity helps bring some of that back. So that's step number one. Sometimes you won't need to do that, but sometimes it will really help. Sometimes you'll need to take even one more step to work on color. And what that is to create a new layer and to call the layer color. And on this layer, let me first demo this in an exaggerated way. I'll grab my brush tool. You want to sample a color in the image which has more hue than you think you need, like let's say the color on the nose here. So with the brush tool, you hold down the Option key on a Mac, Alt on Windows, and click. And if I paint a color here, and what I'm going to do is just paint a color at really high intensity, you can see that it's just like paint on top of an image. But if you take the layer blending mode to color, which is right above luminosity, what it says is say, hey, use this color, but show me everything underneath as well. Well, that is exactly what we want to use for our image. So rather than an adjustment on the cheek, what I want to do is make an adjustment in here. And as we've seen before, it really pays to work with a lower opacity when you're making adjustments like this. And I'm just going to paint in a little bit of color into this area. And I'll do the same thing over here. What that's doing is taking the areas where the shadow is really deep. It didn't have any color at all to start off with. And now I'm bringing in some of this color, putting it on top of that area. And it's just creating a little bit more of a uniform look and bringing a little bit more skin tone back into that part of the image. Now with this, what can happen is you might realize that the color you sampled isn't good. You may need to change it. How do we change that color? Well, you create an adjustment layer above this, which is hue saturation. Now, hue saturation, if I click and drag, can you notice how it's changing everything in the image? But if you click on this icon right here to create a clipping mask, and what that means is this adjustment now only affects the layer underneath. And can you see how it's now only affecting that area where I painted in that color? So what we can then do is say, I'll take this and maybe I want to shift this so it's a little more yellow. Or maybe I want to desaturate it just a touch. I had a little bit too much color in there. Or shift it so it's a little more red. And so we can make those choices here by dragging these sliders around to fine tune this. Now this, of course, is getting a little bit more advanced, and that's why I'm showing you this technique further into the chapter. But as you can hopefully see, this is a technique which can give you really great results. So here was the original portrait after we did our shadow work using the dodge tool, focusing in on those shadows. Then we brought in a little bit of color. And last but not least, we used a hue saturation adjustment layer as a layer clipping mask so that it only affects the underlying layer in order to fine tune that color. And that takes us from here, the before, to here, the after.